Hello and welcome back to Read the World. I'm your host, Derek Main, and I review translated literature. Today's review I am very excited for. We are going to review The Dreamed Part by Rodrigo Fresan, translated from the Spanish by Will Vanderhyden, and this is from Open Letter. So as you can see, this is massive. It is 533 pages in this version, and we can't talk about it without first addressing that it is a sequel. So, and part two of a trilogy. So the first one is The Invented Part. Same Rodrigo Fresan, Will Vanderhyden did the translation, also Open Letter. So The Invented Part was the first. The second is The Dreamed Part, and I believe the third, which isn't out yet, I believe it's The Remembered Part, which will be the third and final part of the trilogy. So it's a little, as you can see, together, that makes 1,000 pages of, or more than 1,000 pages, of Rodrigo Fresan, who is a maximalist writer. There is just a ton stuffed in to this work, and that makes it quite difficult to review. So let me start with this. I loved these works unconditionally. I think they are tremendous. If you are interested in writing about writers, if you're interested in sort of maximalist, modern, contemporary fiction with lots of pop culture references, music, movies, books, lots of other writers, lots of tangents, lots of twisting and twirling into whole separate universes, but grounded by what I would say are two basic things. One, grounded with humor. They're both very, very funny. But secondly, it's grounded with a plot. There is a plot that goes through here that is, I just love the way Fresan does this, right? So what he does is, the plot in parts is so sad and awful for the narrator. It's such a difficult thing to discuss, what it is that he wants to tell, or sort of the biography that he's lived through, particularly with his sister, who is mad, who then becomes a writer. I cannot go into all of the permutations that this thing gets into because, again, massive. But what he does is there will be like tangents and references for just 200 pages, right? And it's all very funny, and you're kind of sucked into this new part of the book, this sort of new section. And then in just a brief whisper of 2 sentences, you'll get that connection to sort of the main biographical plot that is happening. So it's not that there's not plot without, because there is. The whole thing is plotted. It's actually very logical and pretty easy to follow and read. But underneath, there is a very sad story, a very awful story that is still not complete because we're only in 2. That is almost like it's so painful for the narrator to tell this story. My incense is like going right at the camera, so I'm going to move that around to there. Okay, so it's so difficult and painful for the narrator to tell that he almost has to tell it as an aside, as part of something else. Now, these books are not going to be for everyone because they are massive, because there are a ton of references. You have to really enjoy philosophical tangents, humorous tangents, lots of stuff true, sometimes maybe conjecture about real writers. So some of the references, like Nabokov is a huge theme throughout this one. Talking Heads, the band. In the first one, you've got Pink Floyd, The Kinks, F. Scott Fitzgerald, specifically Tender as the Night. You've got Bob Dylan, the Beatles. You know, these are kind of throughout these touchstones of the narrator, who is a writer, that he uses to then tell the plot, but also to understand his own life. And I've said all this without giving you the basic crazy outline of the plot, which is in the invented part, the first one. The writer, aging, disillusioned, decides to break into the Hadron Collider, merge with the God particle, and transform into like a godlike thing that is everywhere and nowhere. Yeah, okay, so that's the plot. In the dreamed part, whether or not that has happened, that part is over, if that makes sense, right? And the dreamed part is sort of a large take with different ways on dreaming. So the invented part is about how a writer invents. And the dreamed part is sort of about how the writer dreams and how we all dream and that connection to reality. I can't go, I don't think, as deep into the linear of the plot because it gives away the first book, and I do think it's really, really enjoyable to read the first book. So I'll leave it at that. I will say that I don't know that it really matters which order you read these in. I think they feel kind of like they're happening simultaneously, even though it's linear. Like you could have read the dreamed part first and had a really unique experience going back to the invented part that would like fill in these things. There's some repetition of whole paragraphs, but told by a different narrator. So like just a couple of perspectives or sentences will change. And I found that really interesting. And sometimes it's the same narrator, like repeating it as if someone is telling you a story and they've told you the story before, but it's either really important to them or they've kind of forgotten, you're talking to a friend, you hear some of the same stories. So that was really interesting, but you could read them in any order. I do think, probably it makes sense to read the invented part first, right? And then the dreamed part. But I did get the sense they were kind of happening at the same, not time, but like when it comes to like energy and thematic quality, they're sort of happening at the same place, on the same plane. So I'm going to do mostly some excerpt reading when it comes to this review. And that's because this is the second part. It's because it is over 500 pages. And because this is the kind of book that you sit and you just enjoy. I remember when I was reading the first 100 pages of the invented part, I was like not quite captured yet, And I was just kind of like, what is going on? This is weird. He drops you right in the middle of this crazy world and you're just disoriented. And then you start to peel past that layer and get more deeper into it. And all of a sudden, it is like a meditative experience. He has got you like by the claws and you are just immersed in his fantastical, incredible world that he has built, that he has invented, and perhaps that he has dreamed and then later maybe remembered. And it is a really, really powerful reading experience that I just cannot recommend enough. So I think excerpting it is probably a better way to sort of explain it for you to decide, all right, I hear these excerpts. Is this something I want to spend a lot of my reading time on? I'm encouraging you to because I think it is that great. But this way you will know whether it is for you or not, because it is maximalist. It is stuffed with references. It is stuffed with tangents. You will go 200 pages on a tangent. They're hilarious. They make the work, but for some readers, that's not their thing, right? There was I think Jonathan Lethem on the back, right? Who's a fan of his. Yep. So he called it kaleidoscopic. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it, because when you think of a kaleidoscope, you move it around like this, and at certain times it looks very blurry, and then you get it just right, and then it kind of crystallizes. That just right is kind of those brief paragraphs I was talking about that are so painful, that just kind of happen every now and then. But every vision that you're looking at through the kaleidoscope is beautiful and wondrous and makes you want to dive in. Another comparison that I thought of while I was reading it, does anybody remember those old magic eye things where you stared at a picture that just looked like an abstract thing, and if you crossed your eyes just right, like a duck would appear in 3D or something. That's what reading this felt like to me. At times, you're looking at it, and you just see the abstractness of it, and it's beautiful. And then at times, you cross your eyes just right, and you see the essence of the thing, the plot of the thing. You see that story that he doesn't want to tell, but is coming out, and it's 3D right in your face. You look away for a second, you start reading again, and you kind of forget about the duck, so to speak. You forget about that image, and then it comes back later. So I thought of that comparison a lot. This is a book, before I do the excerpts, I mentioned before I did this review that this was a book, the invented part, that Chad Post of Open Letter did a 2-month review podcast on. So for 2 months, they read a really large work. Their last one was Ducks Newburyport, brings on a lot of guests. And in the invented part, when they did this one, which was their first season, they had the translator on. And actually at the very end, they had Rodrigo Fresan on, which was awesome. Jonathan Lethem was a guest. And they just read it section by section and talk about it. I did that with the invented part, and it was such an awesome way to read a huge thing and to really engage with the reading. Now, that is going to be the next season, will be the dreamed part, and I encourage you to do it. I'm definitely going to listen to it, though I'm not going to read back because, I was planning on waiting for the podcast and just doing it the same way, but I couldn't wait to read it. I mean, I said in another review when I talked about hinting that I was going to be reviewing this, it just kept calling me from my office in there. I mean, I would just walk past it and I'd have my little stack of TBR and stuff I was excited about, but I kept looking at this and being like, I want to dive into Fresan's world so bad. And so I ended up going ahead and reading it, and I'll follow along. But the podcast is a great way. I definitely encourage you, if you're going to pick up the invented part first, read along with that, because then you're doing 200 pages at a time, and you're going to get kind of like a really funny, nice, casual conversation between folks sort of talking about the text. I mean, nothing crazy in depth. It's more fun, and that's the way to approach this, I think, because it is really fun. All right, so I'm going to start with, on 154, I'm just starting on this to give you a sense of the humor of this thing, okay? I didn't even know that this... All right, I'm just going to say I read this part and immediately went to Google to figure out what was true and not true. And I think you'll find yourself doing that a lot with his work. So we're talking about landing on the moon. Armstrong, so Neil Armstrong, says his celebrated and official little words, and then, almost in a whisper, he adds, on his own account, "Congratulations, Mr. Gorski." That phrase sent the CIA, FBI, and NASA and all the acronyms of the day into a frenzy. Who was Gorski? Was it possibly a coded message for the Russians? Had Armstrong suffered a burst of lunacy? And when he returns to Earth and is interrogated, Armstrong says nothing. He just clarified and promised it wasn't anything that put the national security of the United States at risk, and over the years, Armstrong changes the subject every time the issue comes up in interviews. Many years later, in a report, Armstrong finally tells the tale and the story behind the story. Now that Mr. Gorski has died, Armstrong begins, and he clears up the dark side of what he said and didn't say on the moon. To wit, one day, when he was a little boy, little Nils' ball landed in the yard of the next-door neighbor, one Mr. Gorski. When he went to retrieve it, the boy clearly heard the voice of Miss Gorski coming out from a window, saying and laughing with one of those laughs that cause shame and pain and even fear. "Oral sex? Don't even dream of it, Gorski. You'll get oral sex the day that Armstrong boy steps foot on the moon." All right, I had never heard this. Obviously I know that it's not true, but I had never heard this apocryphal tale or anything. So I thought he invented it, but then I go and it is apparently just sort of a classic Snopes type, fake funny tale. These are the kind of references this guy pulls out. It's insane. And he is, I'm trying to think where he lives. I'm guessing Barcelona. But he's a Spanish, right? He's not, and he is pulling out these totally obscure, Maybe they are. Maybe like you're gonna like view this and be like, Derek, you didn't know that? Like that's a really famous story. I didn't know it. But there's so many like that are hilarious, and you send yourself kind of trying to find, was this a thing, or did you just make this up? And of course it's a combination. Oh my God. All right, so I'm going to go through some of the stuff about reading. Reading is really important to the writer. I think the writer might even put readers at a pedestal above a writer. Like a reader is a writer who is smart enough not to write, kind of thing. So 167, a book belonging to you. I really liked this right here. And Penelope suspects, without understanding very well why she suspects it, that every human being has a book like this, a book that is their destiny, a book by someone else but all theirs, and most everyone passes it by, though it's right there throughout their lives, or never finds it, and they die having never read it. Or they only find it in the last days of their life and wonder through tears, a mix of joy and sorrow, as if they were again flavors of ice cream, irreconcilable yet eaten together all the same, where that book was all this time, where they were that this book wasn't. And I think as readers, that sentiment of always sort of looking for that book and fearful that we will die having not read it is something that we all feel, and that's a really cool sentiment. Of course, we feel there's a book for us, but that idea that we keep going with TBR, lists, and we consume all of this information about new books and classic books we miss, and we just wonder, is there something that I haven't read that would just, that would just bring me to tears, that would just feel like this was written for me, and will I die having not found it? I love that. A note about non-readers on page 187, really quickly, that if you have read this book, these two books, the funniest sections are about this group of people called the Karmas. And I'm just going to describe them as like a Kardashian-like cult family that he describes in the most uproariously hilarious language and sections you could ever imagine. It is a big section of the invented part. It is tremendous. And they make recurrences here as well. But one of this non-reader section is about, this one sentence is about the Karmas. Nothing upsets or unsettles someone who doesn't read more than the happiness of someone reading. And so the Karmas were very distrustful of Penelope, whose favorite book was Wuthering Heights. I did mention that as reference before. Wuthering Heights is a huge part of this book. Even perhaps like a retelling on space written by Penelope. But in space, rather, on the moon. But I really like that idea of like nothing makes someone more upset or unsettled who doesn't read than like seeing you happy reading. Because if you've read in public and stuff like that, you've experienced that, right? Like people just kind of like looking up from their phones and what is that massive tome that's making this person happy? Rereading is a big theme. So on 295, the joys of rereading. And I really like this. I don't do enough rereading, and this actually kind of shamed me into thinking I should. When you reread, you don't just read again and like new something you already read. Rather, that new reading includes a new character in the plot, the reader, and who we were, and perhaps no longer are, when we first read it so long ago. When we reread it, we already know what's going to happen, but we're not entirely clear what's happened to us in the intervening years. And rereading other people's work, we become aware of our own. That's really good. It reminds me of 20-year-old or 21-year-old, something like that, me, obsessed with Infinite Jest. And that my thoughts and feelings around that obsession right now are very different, okay? I don't disregard the book or the author or anything like that. But I do understand more about myself and my taste from reading much, much more. It would be interesting to reread that book. I'm not going to because I have a lot more I want to. But for that one in particular, right? Because that's such a third rail sort of book, right? It's such a hot topic in literary scenes about what its place is, about the author. Every couple of years, like something else kind of comes out that isn't always pleasant about the author and his behavior. There is that bro-lit culture. And I think back to that reader, and I wonder what this reader today would think of that book. So I thought about that. That's just one example, right? Like, there's a ton. Like, I need to reread Pale Fire after so much Nabokov in here. Like, I want to reread that now and see where I am as a person. Page 470. I can't read my handwriting on what this is about, but I think it's another one on writing and reading. And then we'll go to the last two, which are different. These are different. Oh yeah, God, this is hilarious. All right, so he's writing. The writer is he's teaching a creative writing workshop. This is so funny. It floored me. His students were badly written wolves and bad readers. And when one of them would howl, that classic of literary criticism online comment in virtual bookstores, I didn't identify with any of the characters, or none of the main characters seems real to me. He half closed his eyes and responded that they seem implausible to you, but nevertheless they are written, ergo they exist. As far as identifying with them, let's see if I can find some book about someone who goes to a writing workshop because they have nothing better to do with their life. I mean, that is harsh and hilarious. You didn't identify with them? Okay. Let's see if I can get you. All right. Two more sections. These are different. Page 233. One of the karmas. I can't read a bunch around it because it would give away too much of the plot. Because in this major plot point, the head of the karmas, who is this matriarch, is admitting to something that is quite terrible. So I'll go right sort of to the middle. We're going to say Hariz. Hariz is one of the karmas, and it is the daughter of the matriarch who is talking. Hariz was an unresolved issue for me. Hariz could not remain among us because Hariz is a starving time bomb with a thirst for vengeance. She's not the first. There have been spoiled karmas and crazy karmas, but Hariz is spoiled and crazy. The whole thing about people can change is a lie, Penelope. People never change. They just get better or worse when it comes time to be who they always were and are and will be. I do not agree with that sentiment, but I like it. I like the cynicism of that. They just get better or worse when it comes time to be who it is. I really like that part. And the last one I'll do was my favorite section of the whole book. It was not funny. It was an image that will stick with me forever. It is an image I will think about forever. Example. The fact that between one beat and the next, organically and technically, the heart pauses, as if doubting its pace, to then continue on doing its thing. A true petit mort, reminding him that, throughout this long life, everything is hanging by a taut thread or a high wire when it comes to finding a way out of the labyrinth or across the abyss. And so, for that reason, from the day of our birth and all throughout our lives, we never stop experiencing a succession of tiny deaths. A Morse code of dots between dashes, a kind of coming soon, an empty parentheses between a pair of colons until the cardiac rhythm begins to slow and grow more irregular, and the polarities flip, and finally the pause becomes a constant, and the beat a pause and a stop. Meanwhile, and in the meantime, he thinks, that silence that always resides between two beats amounts to the third part of the life of the heart, to another third part, like the slept or dreamed part. I love this book very, very much, and I love both of them. I hope that my review and mostly talking about some sections I like gave you enough to get a sense of if this is something that you similarly, that you also, see, I have to use small words when the big ones won't come out, that you also will love. My next review is going to be a writer I love, Young Moon, Seven Samurai Swept Away in a River, translated from the Korean by Yewon Young, and this is Deep Vellum Press, one of my favorites. Thanks again, everybody. Be good to folks.